and he's explained really what happened. I was a radio reporter during the year-long strike, and everything I reported would be over in 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 45 seconds. So when I got home every evening, I would keep my scripts there. Of course, they'd gone into the ether, and I would cut out what I could see in the newspapers, including all of the cartoons. And Graham was quite correct. It wasn't until last year, when we were getting ready for the 40th anniversary celebrations, that I went through these files day by day. And what struck me, and I said, wow, these cartoons really tell the story. And you've got to remember, 84-5, we're in an age before rolling television. There's no social media. The newspapers are in black and white. Now, there was no dispute, you see, that has equaled the miners' strike for the number of cartoons. The press in the 80s was in its heyday. There were 10 national newspapers, and they were selling 15 million copies a day. There was no color printing, as I said. Most newspapers had one or even two cartoons, and the 1984 strike was like no other, because the leading protagonists, they were sort of ready-made for lampooning by the cartoonists. The strike, though, as we know, divided the country. And just look at this. This is a cartoon by a very famous cartoonist called Trog. It's the end of 1984, and both sides are looking down the mine shaft and wondering, where is 1985 and what's going to happen in 85? So you can see how these cartoons summed up that sense of despair at the end of the decade. Cartoonists, we're going back, you know, have been sort of making fun of politicians. And politicians live in fear of what the cartoonists can do. But fewer press cartoons appear today. I don't think they've got the political clout of what happened back in those earlier years, and you can judge for yourself when you see the cartoons I'm going to show you. Public tastes have changed too. Editors now insist that cartoons must be politically correct. We have to say, and come back to the point that I'm making, that the cartoons caught the mood of the nation. They made this very powerful point, political point, and they were in your face. And indeed, I think that the cartoons of the day often said more than you could capture in a newspaper report. Just look at that cartoon. Now, what we've got here is we've got some young mums. They're out with their little mite, and he's saying scab. And the mum says he said his first word. Now, this is in September 1983. Now, when I saw that cartoon, I thought, this is a cartoonist's license. But no, when I looked, and I don't know whether many of you saw the Channel 4 documentaries on the miners' strike, but there one on Shirebrook, Jane Corbin, a Channel 4 reporter, she actually spent time with the miners' wives. And at 2 o'clock at the shift change at Shirebrook, the young mums would go down, holding their babes in their arms, and the little babes are shouting scab. So that's an actual representation of what was happening. Now, newspaper loyalties, of course, dictate the thrust of many of the cartoons. The cartoonists on the conservative supporting newspapers, they understood their brief. They knew who their targets were, the unions and the Labour politicians. And the dominant Tory press paid the best rates of pay. They had the top cartoonists. And the aim of the cartoon was to reinforce the political message of the newspaper. Now, during the strike, the conservative supporting newspapers almost always favoured Margaret Thatcher. And just a minority were merciless in criticising the government. Most of the cartoons demonised Arthur Scarborough, and he was the lawbreaker. He was the puppet of the Soviet Union. Now, just look at that cartoon. That's from the Sunday Express, and it's by a cartoonist called Cummings, Michael Cummings, and he is the cartoonist who Arthur Scargill reviled most of all, because he said, Cummings did 50 cartoons, here's another one from the Sunday Express, 50 cartoons portraying him as a puppet of the Soviet Union. And he said it was a smear, and it was designed to separate him off from the members of the miners' union. And Scargill counted that there were 50 of these cartoons in the Daily Express and 34 in the Sunday Express. And look, the Soviet Union president at the time is called Chernenko. He was a sort of predecessor of President Putin. It's funny how we forget the names of some of the Soviet presidents, but we might have forgotten Chernenko, but I don't think we're going to forget Putin, are we? Now, the 84 strike was a fertile sort of ground because it really entered, as we know, the public consciousness. And that no cartoonist could have asked for more because, you know, these were larger than life characters and it was a fight to the death. And of course, Mark Thatcher, Ian McGregor, the Cold War chairman, and Scargill himself, they were all publicity seekers. You know, they were ready-made to be mocked. And there was no shortage of drama, was there? You know what we saw? We saw what happened at Orgreave. We saw medieval warfare, didn't we, when we saw the police on horses chasing the strikers. Now, what I wanted to do was just turn the tables now, and let's look at a cartoonist from the left. Now, the Morning Star did, of course, well, every day almost, was backing the miners, and pleading against the police to stop brutality. This is their front page on one of the earlier mass pickets at Orgreave. But after the very big battle of Orgreave, they did this front page with the print workers, and we just heard Bramble talking about it, how the print workers supported the miners. And this is the famous cartoon. We'll see it again now. And you'll see the police. Here they are, lining up. Ian McGregor's in the grave, digging the grave for the mine workers, and here's Mrs. T behind the tombstone. Don't let them bury the miners, she's saying, ha ha. Now, this cartoon by Tony Hall, by the print workers, is now in the Marx Memorial Museum. So it's one of those cartoons that lives on to this day. Now, what I wanted to do was just set the scene of the strike. So initially, the pit closures, and we know that the area strikes started. You remember they started in Yorkshire and in Scotland, that they then spread, and then the National Executive agreed that they would back these rolling strikes. Scargill, of course, believed that the other pits would come out, and of course, flying pickets went to them to try and persuade the working coalfields like Nottinghamshire to join. And we now know that secretly, Mrs. Thatcher, within days, mobilized the police. She said they've got to stiffen their resolve. So let's just see how those early months played out in the cartoons. Well, this is September 1983. This is the September before the start of the miners' strike. And what we now know from Mrs. Thatcher's records is that this was the month that they were secretly discussing the fact that they might need to close as many as 75 pits. Do you remember in the strike, they said, we only want to close 20. Well, we've now got the documentation. So back in the September, the autumn of 1983, this is a famous cartoon by Peter Brooks, and he's indicating that this tidal wave of pit closures is coming, and is King Arthur going to be able to stop it? This is the Daily Telegraph. We're now into the January of 84, before the strike starts in the March. And of course, what they're saying here is that the miners are going to rely on something called the Triple Alliance, the belief that the miners, the railway workers, and the steelmen would all join forces and defeat the closures. But of course, the cartoon by Garland is summing up the real position, which is that the government had been building up the coal stocks. So that although there's an overtime ban, look at the coal stocks. And of course, they were going to prove crucial, as we know, as the strike went on. Already there were splits in the union. This was over the overtime ban. And here's a sort of cartoon picking up the fact that the working miners are already trying to break out in the January of 84. And of course, this is the Sun. This is Stanley Franklin. He's the cartoonist on the Sun. And he's predicting that the NUM is going to be split. And this is in the run-up to the strike. Now, the next slide, what's happened here? What have I done wrong? Now, what have I done wrong there? What do you think I've done wrong to this? That's it. Have I done it right?
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I do apologise. I do apologise. So we now get to the fact that the strike is called, and this is back to Cummings. This is this cartoonist that Scargill so disliked, you see, and he's predicting that if Scargill calls the strike, he's going to, commit harikari. Now, it's very interesting. Beneath it, you see, they say Scargill's not using his hair dry blower. He's playing Russian roulette. Now, that's what I said. There was a bit of comedy almost in the cartoons at the beginning of the strike, because here's Scargill, you see, and you can see his bouffant hairstyle and Margaret Thatcher's bouffant hairstyle. Now, what it was all about was at the 1983 party conference, Labour Party conference, a Sun journalist sat beside Scargill, and when Scargill opened his briefcase, they found that a picture inside was a can of hairspray and a hairbrush. So this is a sequence of cartoons taking the Mickey out of Scargill and Thatcher. But this, you see, is another cartoon from the Daily Telegraph. And here's what I said about the papers. This is Mrs. Thatcher in her Churchillian pose, you see, surrounded by her cabinet, confident that they're going to win the strike. Absolutely confident. Now, this is a shot by the Sun's cartoons. We're in March, so the strike's just getting underway. And of course, what they're predicting here, which was completely wrong, was that the women, the miners' wives, were going to come out and demand a pit ballot and get the men back to work. Of course, as we know, the opposite happened. They weren't the petticoat pickets that the Sun had predicted. And of course, there's an even more interesting cartoon in the Times. They believed, you see, that Mrs. Thatcher's employment laws, which had banned so much industrial action, would stop the flying pickets. And here they are, the flying pickets nailed to the wall. So have the miners been nailed? I.e., they're not going to deliver. That was the Times verdict in March, the 20th of March. So you see what the feelings were. Now then, there was even in the Sun this belief that the strike was going to be over. We're in April now. It was going to be over within a matter of months, weeks, whatever it is, and they'd be selling off the pits. That's what they're talking about there. And of course, why was that belief? Well, already the government had worked out that if they were prepared to offer lots of redundancy money, they'd be able to buy off strike action. That's what Ian McGregor is offering. Now, the reality, of course, was that the flying pickets were beginning to get to work. And the bullies sent Pitt's victory, says the Mail, because McGregor was having to decide what was he going to do about the success of the flying pickets, because they were bringing out more of the pits. And of course, the strike was very solid in the areas where they were on strike. And the question is, what was the government going to do? And of course, this is typical of the Sun. You see, they've got dictator Scarlin, you can see Scargill, and you can see with the hammer and sickle sign. So that's the way newspapers like the Sun reported it. Now then, already though, we're getting news. This is from the Newsline, one of the newspapers on the left, that the police were already moving in, as of course we knew. And of course, we've got quite a few early pictures. We're still in March, and already the police are stopping people on the motorways, which is an interesting picture. It's picked up by the cartoonists, you see, who are, here we are. We've got the NUM on the move, which I think sort of sums up. They're still campaigning for a ballot, and they're predicting here that the miners are going to chip away at Scargill and get to him and influence him. This is the Telegraph again, and this is a mock eye test for Scargill to see whether he can actually pick out the words ballot before calling strike action. Again, it's part of that newspaper campaign. They still were going to attack Scargill constantly on the failure to hold a pithead ballot. And of course, here is the suggestion that actually he's going to be knifed in the back by them all. But it didn't happen. That was certainly the prediction of the Tory press. But you see, here's again Cummings, you see. Again, this is this depiction of Scargill, this constant depiction of him as this Soviet puppet. And you can see why this was something that really reviled Scargill. He thought it was a calculated attempt to smear him. And of course, this is typical of the Daily Mail, because they believed it was a war on democracy. And there's Scargill, the dictator again. This is Mick McGahey, and of course you can see that the Labour politicians are all in the Union's pocket, and that's Mick McGahey, and they're throwing bricks at the cops. This is another cartoon by the famous cartoonist Troll, and again he sort of captures the mood towards a better yesterday, and he's raising the question, the peril of the miners' civil war. Are the miners being led to potential downfall? It's sort of raising the question, and we're into the April of 1984, the first month of the strike. This is significant. This is in Labour Weekly, and what they're showing here is Arthur Scargill with a miner's lamp. He's trying to conjure up the spirit of 74. Why was 74 so important? Well, of course, that's the year that the miners defeat Ted Heath. You remember he calls that general election in 1974, who runs the country because of a miners' strike. Ted Heath loses, Labour get in, and the miners get a 35% pay increase. But of course, the reality is that the miners of today, of 84, are fighting one another. So that's again something that just shows you those sort of doubts that were there at the time. Again, this is also playing on the same thing. Could Scargill fill the boots of Joe Gormley? Because, of course, he'd taken the miners in 1972, they got a 27% pay increase, and in 74, they got a 35% pay increase. Of course, they were getting back towards the top of the manual earnings league. That was where the miners wanted to be, and they were there by the 80s. Now, this is significant. There were demands, of course, for a pithead ballot. And we saw this famous picture of Scargill talking to the miners. This was after a meeting. It's in April. And what happened was there were attempts to try to force a pithead ballot, and they were defeated. But you see, there's Mick McGahey standing there beside Scargill, and there's Scargill with the megaphone. Now, if you were a cartoonist, you've got to be following the news. And this obviously was the news of the day. And you see, one of the cartoonists picks it up straight away. There's Scargill, you see. Men, there will be no ballot until we change the rules. And then you see McGahey, and you can almost see the cartoon mirroring a replica, if you like, of the news photo. And that's the challenge for the cartoonists. They had to have a new cartoon all the time. Now, I wanted to introduce you to another very famous, and this is a Barnsley cartoonist. He's from Barnsley, called Alan Hardman. He died this year, and the book's being brought out of his cartoons. And he was the cartoonist for the militant tendency. And this cartoon is quite significant because what he's showing is that, look, there are the coal stocks with McGregor and Mrs. Thatcher with their helmet. But this is the strength of the unions, you see, the steel, the miners, the solidarity. And he's predicting that the solidarity of the NUM is going to win through. But Alan Hardman, we'll see more of his work in a moment. He died earlier this year, and a book is being brought out. And we're going to see some more of his images in my presentation. Now, of course, what happened was we just saw the prediction that the steel workers would stand solid with the miners. Well, of course, the reality was they didn't. Here's cowboy coal coming through and being accepted at the Ravenscraig Steelworks in Scotland. The coal convoys beat the strike. Of course, it leads to this clash between Arthur Scargill on the right, and this is Bill Sears, the leader of the Steelworkers Union. What the steelworkers were saying was, look, we're not going to sacrifice our steelworks. We will accept coal, even if it has to come from abroad. We're going to keep the coal flowing, the coke flowing, because without it, our steelworks will close. And it's a sort of getting to this sort of ultimatum that Scargill has issued to the steelworkers to stop working. And of course, the steelmen are not going to accept it. And here's another picture, a cartoon on the same image. You see, with Scargill having knifed the steelworkers in the back. That's the way it was perceived. Now, the Ravenscraig battle. Again, you see, we see another cartoon of Cummings, but I wanted just to show you the setting. So that's the sort of page that you'd have. This is, again, the Daily Express. But let's just look at that cartoon that was up there. This is Len Murray, who was the TUC General Secretary. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher is pleased as punch because her union reforms, this is the legislation to stop secondary picketing and to demand ballots, has all been gone through. Here's Scargill, he's facing the working miners and the steelmen, and he's in trouble. And Len Murray, now Len Murray was the TUC General Secretary, and it was thought that he would somehow be able to intervene to bring some sort of resolution to it. But and we're now into May, Len Murray just decided he couldn't see any way out. And of course, the cartoonists picked it up because here he is, this is in the sun, and they've got him. This is Len Murray, knifed in the back, and you can see the hammer and sickle. And this again is the Telegraph, and they're showing how this is the TUC, the famous cart horse of the TUC. Len Murray is pulling it one way. Scargill wants the TUC, of course, to authorise strike action in support of the miners. Len Murray is saying no. Eventually, Len Murray throws in the towel and decides to retire. And there he is, off to retirement with his banner, no sympathy strikes, because that's what Scargill wanted. He wanted the TUC to demand sympathy strikes. So the cartoons are telling us this story in quite a graphic way. Here's the TUC just sort of leaving the scene. Now that's the sort of cartoon I wouldn't be able to have shown you. I shouldn't really be able to show you. It wouldn't be done today. They're depicting Scargill as a gollywog. Now, that just would not be permitted by an editor today. But, I mean, there's Roy Hattersley, you see. The Race Relations Board are already saying you shouldn't be depicting somebody as a gollywog. I assure you, there's nothing racist about it. It's just Mr. Scargill who's received two lovely black eyes from the Notts miners, the steelworkers, and Terry Duffy. But it's just a sort of representation of the sort of imagery that just would not be possible today. And this is part of what I say, you see. These cartoons were rather like the social media of today. You know, if you think of how provocative things can be on Twitter and on these other social platforms, well, that's what the cartoons were like. Now, of course, by the summer of '84, there's this grim realization that there's no end in sight, no quick end to it. The NUM still believes their industrial strength will prevail. Mrs. Thatcher stiffened the resolve of the police. There were few, if any, talks. There were daily reports of violence. Looming on the horizon on June the 18th is the Battle of Orgreave. And the task of cartoonists supporting the NUM was to try to rally the strikers, you see, and condemn the police. That's what the cartoonists on the left, that was their charge. Here he is. This is Scargill. This is the commentary in the press, digging in for a long fight. It's going to be a fight to the finish, says the Sun, and there's Scargill in his usual mad dictator uniform. This is the Yorkshire miner, and they're saying if the coal board do try to enforce a ballot, we'll tear them up. But I wanted to show you the little cartoon, you see. This is one of the NUM cartoonists, Eric Booth, and he's showing here, you see, this is the scab colliery, and here are the working miners going through like sheep, saying, for ballot. Anyway, it's just a sort of pickup of the way in which the job, this is the miner, the special miner, what they're already picking up, you see, and you'll see this theme constantly coming through about the police constantly pulling people off picket lines. And that's the image that you see there, you see. So there are the cops. They're ignoring burglaries, rapes, and murder and they're pulling up this fella. I arrest you for disturbing the peace. That was sort of part of the course. Another thing that came through early on in the miners' union was the telephone tapping, and they were writing cartoons about it. So here's the police listening in to these NUN people. And of course, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we all know there was considerable phone tapping. And if you take something like Orgreave, there's no doubt about it. The police knew exactly the movements of the people involved. So here's another. This is from the socialist worker. And what they're describing here is the difference between a scab and a copper. And at the end of the day, of course, the copper says, well, the difference with me is that I will still be working in 4 years' time. But of course, the miner's cigarette dropping from his mouth knows he'd probably be out of a job. So this was the attempt of the cartoonists on the left, was to try to keep up morale. You see, this is it, you see. The copper saying, I'm getting paid £350 a week to break the strike. And this is the working miner, the scammer. Well, I'm getting £350 a week too. I read the Daily Mail. But as I said, the policeman says he'll have the job at the end of the day, and the scam won't. Another typical miners' union cartoon with McGregor and Thatcher being whisked off to the mental asylum. But again, it's an illustration of the tough task that the cartoonists on the left have. Again, a typical, this is one of those sort of portraits where Scargill and McGregor are just not agreeing to negotiate. Again, it's picked up constantly. All of the talks collapse, Pitt summit collapses, you see. And of course, here again is how the cartoonists describe it. This is Peter Walker, the Energy Secretary, and Scargill is said to have marched his men to the top of the hill, no pit closures, no job losses, and here they all are marching down the hill again. The stalemate. This is a cartoon by Gibbard. He's the Guardian's cartoonist, and he's explaining that it's just, they're just talking, well, they aren't talking. There's just a wall between the two sides. The Sun, of course, has it in a more dramatic way that the two are just about to shoot each other with their guns. This is the Cummings again, and they're just saying that Scargill is just a long playing record saying, you know, he wants the government to surrender, which of course is not going to happen. And here again, you get that same sense, that deadlock. Here's Scargill with his megaphone, and there's the megaphone for McGregor, and they're just not going to talk sense. They're just going to shout at one another. That's the inference. And here, of course, is Mrs. Thatcher playing the Punch and Judy with Scargill and McGregor bashing the senses out of one another. And again, you see there is McGregor, really Mrs. Thatcher's puppet. So you sense the deadlock that was there, that was captured by the cartoonists. This is an interesting little interlude. Anne Scargill, Arthur Scargill's wife, was arrested because of something that had happened on a picket line. Of course, this is ready-made for the cartoonists. This is the Sun. There's Mrs. Scargill inside, with the Scargill family lining up outside. Here, this is the Daily Mail's cartoonist back, and he's got Mrs. Scargill inside, and they're saying, well, if our kids can get themselves arrested as well, we'll all have a decent meal inside the police station. That's what it's sort of saying. So it was a sort of interlude. Now, we come to, of course, Orgreave itself and the charge of the police. Now, this is the May charge. There was a charge, there were mounted police were used in May and again in June. And of course, they were very, very serious moments. And you remember, Scargill gets arrested. He gets arrested in the picket in May. And there were lots of pictures. Now, this is typical Sun cartoon. They're playing on porridge with Fletcher in the top, but reading the newspapers that Scargill's been arrested, and he's telling the miners, I'm sorry, mate, you've come to the wrong cell, if you're thinking of freeing Arthur Scargill. And they're going to take their fight to Parliament. Now, the little cartoon on the right is very indicative of the sense of despair on the left, because what they're showing is that, look, This football match is between minor, but look what's lined up against them at the big match. The law, the government, the police, the press, the television, and big business. So you can see who's going to win that match. So that's how the left viewed the tussle in cartoons. Now this is the Morning Star on the morning after the Battle of Orgreave. And this, of course, is the moment when Scargill gets injured and Scargill in hospital after a bloody battle. What's interesting, reflection now, is that a lot of the, and of course the Times was very much supporting the government. They use pictures, if you look at them, of pickets doing things to the police. There's not a shot on the front page of the police charging through. They've obviously decided that they're going to put the boot in to the miners' union. There's Scargill being helped along, and he ends up in hospital overnight. There was an argument as to who hit him on the head. Here he is in hospital, you see, and Mrs. T, they're making a mockery of it. She too is in trouble because she's had some bad election results. So there they are, both in hospital. You're not the only one who's been getting a clobber in, she says. This is, again, the Sun. And what they're doing is they're winding up, which we're going to see a little bit more of in a moment, the problem that Neil Kinnock has. You see, Neil Kinnock is in a bind as to whether or not he's going to come out in full support of the miners or whether he's going to declare himself against the violence. And of course, the Sun is saying, we found out who hit Arthur the other day, i.e. Neil Kinnock. So it's just a joke at Kinnock's expense. Now, this, of course, is the famous shot of Leslie Bolton. She is this woman who is at Orgreave, and this is a famous picture by John Hacks. He takes, that's frame 1 and that's frame 2. And there were some suggestions that this was a sort of fake picture, but everybody agrees, 99% of us agree that that's picture 1 and that's picture 2. Of course, what it did, and is quite significant, is that it vindicated, if you like, what became the motif from then on, which was that you had coppers with a truncheon crashing down on people's heads. That's Arthur Scargill. This is a cartoon by Alan Hardman, the man I said to you, who comes from mining stock in Barnsley, and he's the cartoonist for the militant. And he says, I'm arresting you for obstructing my truncheon. This is what the cop says. But what it did, you see, is what those pictures that we just saw, what they validated was, there it is, in picture form, cops hitting people on the head with their truncheons when they're just protesting. And this, again, is another cartoon by Trump, the famous cartoonist in The Observer, and he's hitting the fact that the cops are knocking the hell out of the miners, and the miners are knocking the hell out of the police. And The Observer and the man in the corner said, well, it's hard to choose between a police state and a picket state. And this is June. So you can begin to see that there's that sort of, again, this questioning sense by some of the cartoonists. Anyway, we saw the trouble up in Scotland with the steel works continuing. The same was happening down at Llanwern, where this is a convoy of lorries in the far picture being escorted by police, because the Llanwern steel works, they are determined that they're not going to close, because they feel that if they're going to close, they're never open again. And here's Bill Sears. We saw him, he's accusing Scargill, you see, of trying to set the whole thing alight. So it's, again, reminiscent of that feud. And this, again, is Bill Sears, and he's about to biff Scargill. So this was this great, the fear that the steel workers were going to become the victims of the strike. There was also, of course, a dock strike in the summer of 1984, and that was really worrying Mrs. Thatcher. And of course, miners' union were to blame, it was said, because they called out the dockers in support, or the dockers had come out in support. And it leads to the first and only time in the strike when the cartoonists for the Tory papers begin to have a few doubts. Here's Mrs. Thatcher, you see, stuck in number 10, and she's worried. She's got the miners causing trouble, interest rates causing trouble, and the docks causing trouble. And you see here, this is the Sunday Times, and they too are picking up the jitteriness in number 10. And there's Mrs. Thatcher, you see. She's saying we're in good shape, and everyone's laughing because, look, she's got the miners' strike, the pound's falling, interest rates are rising, there's a dock strike. And this, of course, historically is seen as the moment when perhaps the government were on the run. And that's picking it up too, you see. Hello, that's the travel agency. I'm afraid I've got to cancel my trip, you see. Pit strike entering its 26th week. Something unexpected has turned up. So that was the moment. We're August now. There was undoubtedly that tension within the government as to whether they would survive. Now, by the summer, though, there was no sign really of a deal. The reality was that the government were increasingly confident that the coal stocks would be sufficient. The talks were getting nowhere. There was no sign of wider action in support of the NUN. There was a brief setback, you remember, because the pit deputies in NACODS, they voted to join the strike. But then, to Arthur Scargill's anger and dismay, NACODS agreed a separate deal with the Coal Board. And we then see this phrase, new faces. More and more men are going back to work. But what you now begin to detect is that the cartoonists, especially for the popular papers, are increasingly depicting the miners as thugs. And it's quite a sort of worrying development, as you'll see. So Scargill, this is the government, Walker, the government energy secretary, saying Scargill won't shut Britain. Coal stocks will last well into 1985. That's the sense of confidence that the government had. Of course, we're coming up to the TUC conference in September, and this is another Gerald Scarfe cartoon, and he's saying, well, look, this is the TUC facade of unity. The reality is that they're fighting hammer and tong behind the poster. That's the reality of it. And of course, we see Scargill and McGregor fighting it out, and the country paying the price. And of course, we're getting towards the final months of the strike. And already you see the cartoonists, this is in the Evening Standard, are picking up the thought that the NUM ship is sinking and the TUC is in the lifeboat. Let's take another vote on whether we should pick up Arthur as the ship goes down, sort of summing up the mood. We had a brief interlude because McGregor, at one of his talks in Scotland, appeared and put a plastic bag in front of his face. It was a bit of a joke, he said. He wanted to show people that, because everybody was accusing him of playing hide and seek, so he sort of went along with the joke. And he's looking out, he's looking out through the handholds of the plastic bag. Well, you couldn't have had a better gift for the cartoonist, could you? Because here they are, you see, here's Scargill and Peter Heathfield and Mick McGavin welcoming McGregor, and then he's just about to go plonk down there because he doesn't realise he's walking out of the window at the top of a block of flats. Again, here's another picture you see with Scargill looking at McGregor. But McGregor's making the point. It's a box, Arthur, with a little slot in it. Like this is where people put their votes. So it's playing back to the lack of ballot. Here again is another. This is the Coal Board all running around. Instead of looking like headless chickens, they're all looking like people with plastic bags on their heads. As I said, we're now coming up to the Labour Party conference. And of course, the papers are still depicting Kinnock, who is the dog, as Arthur Scargill's poo. That's the way they wanted to portray it. This is the Daily Mail, and of course, it's putting the knife in so it leaves. Even the Mirror has to accept that as Kinnock walks along the seafront at Blackpool, who's behind him but Arthur Scargill and the coal industry? And there, this is the dilemma. You know, here's Neil Kinnock, like the canary. Is he going to be able to escape? Of course, I told you how Mrs. Thatcher is lauded. Here she is, you see, and she's saying at her conference, Tory conference, let's have a standing ovation for our benefactors. Their benefactors being Arthur Scargill and Mick McGahey. And this is the Conservative cabinet around them, you know, Lawson, Geoffrey Howe and Willie Whitehall. So it sort of brings it all back, doesn't it, that sort of shot. Anyway, the safety men, the NACOTs, order a strike, as I explained, but then, of course, renege on it. Scargill is seen for a moment as being somebody who's in luck. This is going to be the moment. His lucky strike. But as I said, NACOTs backed off, and of course, soon the papers were back to their regular theme that this campaign for no pit closures was a dying cause. That's what it's showing, this cartoon background. Even the Conciliation Service, ACAS, the Arbitration, Conciliation and Advisory Service, they're sort of depicted in this picture of the famous screen picture, that there's just nothing that anybody can do because Scargill and McGregor are boxing one another's ears. This is the Sun, says that the talks are getting nowhere, that they'll carry on until they're skeletons. Here's Scargill in his wheelchair coming up and having a look at a bit of coal. Again, it's Cummings of the Express. We then get this brief interlude when Roger Windsor, the man on the right, is seen in Libya. There's this suggestion that he's gone to get money for the miners. And of course, the cartoons love it. Here's Mad Scargill, the mad Colonel Gaddafi character, with a pistol to the head of the Cold War chairman. Here's Colonel Gaddafi himself. Please rest assured, Mr. Scargill, we have a deep and abiding interest in mines. They're making a point about mines at sea, of course. And of course, here again is Mick McGahey and Scargill ruining the headlines. The British press, they're carrying on about the headlines. Of course, Cummings, back to his usual theme, has got, you know, how Scargill, you see, look at the club that he's got and the nail in it, standing next door to Gaddafi, and this is the IRA, and there's poor little Neil Kinnock, the canary in the cage, saying, let me get out. So these are the cartoons. This is, again, the Daily Express. And the politics of it are pretty strong, aren't they? This is a Daily Mail cartoon, again, by Mac, and they're making the suggestion, they're making a cartoon of the fact that here's Libya with the money, and Scargill, realizing that this would be a disaster, is saying, no, there's some mistake, it's the wrong address. The Guardian picks up, though, the fact that these final months of the strike, support is ebbing away. And look, ye saucy Xmas bonus. What was happening was that the Cold War was mounting this big campaign to offer men Christmas bonuses if they go back to work. So here's McGregor offering money and the threadbare Scargill. Here are the men going back to work. This is a Peter Brooks cartoon. Back to work, here we go. Look, all with the pounds in their pockets. They can even biff Scargill on the way in. This was another fascinating interlude. It's a noose. And I was down in South Wales in Aberafan. What happened was that Norman Willis, who'd taken over from Scargill, went down to try to pacify the miners in South Wales. And as he was speaking, it was in a sort of schoolroom, from one of the sort of bars up top, somebody dropped this noose down behind Norman Willis. Well, of course, that became an image that again captivated the cartoonists, as we'll see in a second. Anyway, the point is, there was a lot of disruption and violence. There was a fear that there wouldn't be much more violence, and that the strike, you know, was getting to dangerous proportions. Cartoon. And these are miners' pickets, all with their clubs. Anyway, they've even thought that Scargill's house needed to be burnt down because they'd mistaken it. Sorry, Arthur, we were told it's the home of somebody who worked during the strike. So it's, but what concerned so many people was that this is the depiction of the miners in cartoon look with hoods and with clubs. And people were beginning to comment on the degree to which this was happening. Now, what have I done wrong? What did you do last time? Did I do something wrong? It won't go on then. Is that it? I'm saying. I'm so sorry, ladies and gentlemen. So the sugar motion there. Yeah, and there's another typical, this is the idea that Scargill is sort of leading the Church of Scargillology. But again, look, you see the miners, the pickets, all depicted as thugs. And it was quite a serious moment. Here's the miners' union with its head in the sands, the typical cartoon imagery of the time. And again, we see here this cartoon imagery about, as I've said, this constant imagery of people being picked up and being taken away by the cops. This is again on the left. Here's another cartoon from the left. Say that again, son, and I'll be forced to defend myself, says the copper about to hit the young lad. This again is another, this is the Newsline magazine, and they're describing, you see the police completely circling a miners' picket. Now, we're now getting to this moment when Scargill is about to face the music with regards to Kinnock, because here's Kinnock doing a run-up and finally escaping, the great escape, because Kinnock's getting to the point where he's going to have to put some distance between himself and the miners. And here you see it in cartoon form, that there's Kinnock, you see the poodle again, with Scargill leading the way. They're in this showdown, the two of them are in a showdown. And you see here, this is appeared in the Sun, because Arthur Scargill and Kinnock were going to share a platform at a miners' rally in Stoke-on-Trent. And I went up there. And of course, the Sun was predicting that the minute that Scargill and McGahey saw Kinnock, he'd be frightened, scared out of his wits. Feel free to speak your mind, Neil, says Scargill with the gun to his head. Well, what happened was, that's the picture of the speech. Now, that's Roger Windsor looking very, very sour. There's Neil Kinnock trying to bring some reality to it. There's one of the Labour MPs, Stan Orme, applauding, and Joe Ashton over there. And there you see Scargill stony-faced, because Kinnock, for the first time, is putting a bit of distance between himself and Arthur Scargill. Now, what happened was that story was completely blown away, because down in South Wales, there was a terrible accident where some pickets on a motorway bridge dropped a concrete block and killed a taxi driver who was taking a working miner to work. Now, that, of course, meant that newspapers like The Sun could go to town. You see anarchy, murder, violence. You see, and that miners' pickets up on the bridge, look. We would not have a murder if Scargill had called a ballot. So there it is in black and white. This again is Cummings, you see, with the pit strike just about to drop the concrete block on Kinnock's head. Here's the miners' union executive meeting while the funeral of the dead taxi driver is taking place. Now, there was no truce over Christmas. On the strike front, it was becoming a numbers game. Mrs. Thatcher was counting down to declaring victory, you see, and pressure was building in coalfields like Wales for a return to work. There was a special conference, as we know, and then finally the sad and dignified scenes as the men went back to work. And the conference voted by 98 votes to 91 to go back to work, and it was South Wales which had led the way. So let's just look at the final sequence of pictures. So here we have Christmas. This is the Christmas run up to Christmas, and they're predicting that there's going to be no peace. So we're not going to get any of the Christmas truce that we had in the First World War. There's going to be no football this Christmas in no man's land. This is the Observer on December the 23rd. At the end of the year, the BBC Today program always has a poll for the most popular person of the year. The man who won the poll was Arthur Scargill. Anyway, this is a cartoon of Mrs. Thatcher, really annoyed. Scargill, man of the year, says the BBC, and there she is, jumping up and down on the newspaper. But of course, the reality is that Scargill was on his way to accept defeat. And here he is, the down and out on the bench. This is Garland in the Telegraph. And the ministers are going to leave the pit strike to run on until it collapses. That was the confidence of the government. Here's another Telegraph cartoon predicting 40% of the men are back at work now. Scargill's got his gun and a glass of brandy, and he's about to call it a day. Thatcher puts the boot in. Coal strike lost. This was the Mirror predicting that Scargill had accepted defeat. Here they were going to say, this is a cartoon in the Standard predicting that Scargill would portray it as, or it would be portrayed as the great betrayer because they'd failed to come out and support him, the other unions. The Coal News is the coal board's paper, men back at work in all areas. Even, this is Peter Brooks again, the whiff of defeat. And here it is, Paul Routledge, even he was detecting it. And you see the poor old canary this time is Scargill, and 50% back at work, and the canary's on his back. This is another cartoon by Alan Hardman, and he was picking up that it was going to end in defeat. This is the 1st of February, 85. And you get the sense here that the pit closures are coming and they're crushing the men. And it was rather like that earlier cartoon that we opened with when we saw that tidal wave of closures. So they're sort of picking up the reality. Of course, his message is that unity is survival. I missed one then. But of course, what was happening was that they were offering the money. You'd get £1,000 if you went back to work, you see. And there's McGregor calling the man back to work. It's February 25, just before the vote to come back. And this lad, again, this is an Alan Hardman cartoon. Will we be able to buy it back when I want a job, Dad? So the miner's taking the money, the pit's going to be closed, and the son says, will we be able to buy it back? Well, we know the answer to that. And there it is. That's the reality as it was seen by the Telegraph, that the working miners finally ate Arthur Scargill. This was the day of reckoning when the conference votes to go back. That was the Sun front page on the day of the defeat. You can see how harrowing the two men look. No amnesty. That was one of the terrible things that happened. The bitter end. The only cartoon that I could find that sort of showed anyone making light of the defeat, this is in the Mirror. And they've got poor old Lawson, Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor. He's having to pick up the bills. Mrs. P has got the champagne, but Lawson realizes, look, the strike, the losses that has caused the country. He screamed for his blood as the strike is called off. That's typical of the caricatures that you'd have seen in the time. Pit strike ends tomorrow. That is this famous picture of Maerdy, the pit in South Wales, where no one had gone back to work. And on the day they go back to work, the lodge with the banner, they all walk up the road to the pit, where the pit is. And even all the village dogs will come along. Can you see here the dogs accompanying everybody? So I'm going to end. This is a cartoon that was done about me by Trog. Because I was a radio reporter and I was always chasing Arthur Scargill, they made the joke that I'd even managed to get him to say something if he was sitting on the loo. But I'm going to end on a more serious one. That's a very famous cartoon. Well, it's not a cartoon, really. It's a poster by Alan Hardman. He's the Barnsley cartoonist. And you'll see that reproduced in quite a bit. Your class, save the bits. So we should go to black now, and I can take any questions, if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, that's an hour gone very quickly. Let's just open it up. Any questions? Anybody want to make any points to Nick?
What could we do better next time?
I'm sorry?
What could we do better next time?
Well, I don't know. But what did you think? Well, you're a genius with the pen and ink. What did you think of the cartoons when you saw them all in?
Yeah, there's quite a few that I remember.
Do you remember them, do you?
The one I think particularly, I was trying to find the picture of it, was my record with the plastic, with the bag on it.
With the plastic bag, yes.
I tried, I know to find it, so I think we might have to history books.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. Whenever I talk about this, people remember the cartoons, and that makes my point.
I remember him coming out to
That's right.
a limousine
With the plastic bag on his head. Yeah.
Everybody knew what it was.
Yeah, yeah. But it is interesting how the cartoons, people do remember the cartoons. Sorry, I moved out of shot and I shouldn't have done, I beg your pardon. Any other questions at the back?
Okay.
Yes, please.
It's not a question, but many years ago when I was at university, I happened to be on the same course as the Central Committee. And I saw him one day reading the Financial Times. And I said, what on earth are you doing reading that? And he said, you need to know what the enemy are thinking. And that's your presentation sort of brilliant. Because I don't read the Telegraph, I don't read the Express, I don't read the Scum, I don't read any of those newspapers. I was very active during the strike, and I remember very, very few of those cartoons. And it shows how effective they are at convincing people about wrong things. And we have allowed the media to take control of this.
That's right.
I think
That's right. You can see how those constant themes come through, don't they? About, no ballot, about Scargill being a Soviet dupe. Those are the things that came through. But you see, it was very chilling, wasn't it, when you saw those pictures of, miners' pickets dressed as hooded thugs with baseball bats. That was a worrying set of, to think that was the cartoon imagery that was appearing in so many of the papers. As you say, it's frightening when you think back on it.
Just one little point. You showed the Leslie Bolton, the John Harris Leslie Bolton. It's very interesting. That is the photo, which unequivocally shows a policeman quite willing to batter a woman's skull in. Which papers did it have appear in? One, Labour Weekly, with the slogan, she was only trying to help. A tiny, tiny picture appeared in the Observer. So that narrative of picket line violence, which was continuous, that was the one that was presented. And of course, we know that the number of people who were arrested, were jailed, were falsely imprisoned. Not one policeman. If you saw the three programs, the one that was most chilling on the miners' strike, it was Russell Broomhead. Did you see it? Russell Broomhead, who is traumatized still by what happened to him at Aubrey that day. He'd already been beaten once. And then another policeman comes and beats him up and breaks his truncheon on his head. That narrative was never, ever in the media. But the Leslie Bolton picture, and by the way, I was with John Harris speaking with him in Birmingham 2 or 3 weeks ago. And he had a magnificent collection of the report photos. And I paid tribute to the photographers because those report photographers were the ones. The man who ran report was a man called Simon Gutman. He was a German refugee. And he said to people like John, I don't want any pictures long distance. You get in there and show me what's happening. And there's an incredible photo by John Sturrock. I don't know how he did it, but it's a photo taken just as the morning light is coming up. And he must have, unless he was using a very long photo lens, I don't think he could have been, he gets a troop of mounted policemen go in at a picket line in a Yorkshire pit. And it's an absolutely riveting photo, but those photos never appeared. Report photos never appeared in the
No,
papers that
no.
you've been talking about.
But I mean, just to bear out what Granville says, I mean, the cartoonists on the left certainly picked up the importance of that truncheon being hit on the
Yeah.
head, and it really is validated, isn't it, by the reality of the pictures.
Yeah.
Of the figures.
Anyway, anybody else? There must be some other people.
Yes, please.
Well, it's more of an observation question. Something I really enjoyed it tonight. Have you ever thought about bringing a book out based on your talk tonight and, in volleyball with the cartoons in?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the Alan Hardman's family are bringing out a book of his cartoons. Yes, I've got a leaflet, I can give it to you about it. But you're quite right. I mean, there would be a marvelous. You see, I mean, as Granville said, I'm a bit of a nutcase. I cut all these things out of newspapers. I mean, I have just shown you a selection. I mean, I've got hundreds of cartoons.
We've probably seen, maybe 100 or so tonight. How many roughly do you think you've got in your collection?
Well, I should think several hundred, 300 or 400 at least. And what I wanted to do was try and pick some themes out for you, for example, to show you how Skarga was depicted as this, Soviet lackey, this dupe, to pick out the thuggery, to pick out how the left tried to counter the images from the right. So I was trying to sort of give you some themes, but what was fantastic about it was, you see, some of the newspapers had 2 or 3 cartoons in each edition, because of course there wasn't social media, there wasn't 24-hour news, and they really are, aren't they? When you think of them as black and white, they are in your face, aren't they? And some of the ones, for example, by that cartoonist Trog, really do sort of capture, don't they, the moment. And what people say about some of these cartoons is that they almost say more than a journalist or a photographer could say, because their impact is so great. The strength of the graphic dynamic.
Can I just give it? You said the idea of a book is a possibility, but it did write a really good, brilliant double-page spread in Media North,
Which is
to
a
go
copy of-
online. About 2 issues ago, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of the cartoons are in there as well. I just wanted to mention, while you were talking, Nick, you kept having the images of Skarga with the hammer and sickle.
Yeah.
When we did with Banners Held High, the early versions in the Unity Hall, a man called Christopher Hart approached me. He was an academic, and he was an English lecturer, and he'd been studying the newspapers from the time and the images and cartoons. And he wrote a chapter in one of the books, The Place of Blood, The Miners' Strike and a Warmongering Media. And he's got some incredible pictures, which shows not Arthur Skarga as a dupe of the Kremlin, but as a fascist. He's got him as Hitler leading his troops. And they're really disturbing insight. So the point you were making, it wasn't just that it was about, the way it was depicted, the violence there, but the caricatures were quite relentless. So he could be both a fascist and a Kremlin stooge in the thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sir. Yeah.
My daughter worked for the Liverpool commercial radio station in the 90s, and she was always led to believe, and there's some truth in it, that the police who supported Thatcher in the miners' strike appealed to Thatcher again, or to the government, for support following the Hillsborough problem. I don't know whether there's any truth in that. She seemed to think that was true. So the police said, "We helped you in the miners' strike. Come and help us now."
Yeah.
To do with the Hillsborough thing.
Well, I mean, on Hillsborough, I do think that there's a link with the South Yorkshire Police in terms of the narrative about what happened at Orgreave, and they were attacked by the pickets, and it was only when the trial of the 90-odd miners arrested at Orgreave that the police tape, as we now know, was showed the exact opposite of what happened. So the link between the South Yorkshire Police and the fabrication of evidence and the fabrication of evidence at Hillsborough was quite clear. And I mean, I never thought I had to say this, but we have to acknowledge that it was Theresa May who actually supported the idea of the inquest and the inquiry into Hillsborough. But we should recognise it was Andy Burnham, when he was the minister, who said there should be an inquiry into Hillsborough, so that's when we began to get the truth. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, your question at the back? Strips, cartoons. Oh, my script of what I said. Yes, I've got my script. Yeah, yeah, I kept them all. Yeah, yes, it's what happened was, you know, I kept my scripts. You see, the thing is, if you work for radio, it's sort of gone, you know. But I would keep my scripts, and I would add to it all of the newspaper cuttings and cartoons, because I just thought it was just such a marvelous. You see, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I'm a journalist. I can look back. I mean, I've been a journalist for 60 years. I would have to say, you know, the miners' strike. I know how woeful it was for a lot of people, but for a journalist, I covered the thing. You know, it was the story of a lifetime for me. I know it sounds sad to say that, as though I'm benefiting from people's misfortune, but from a journalistic point of view, it was a great challenge.
And also, I need to say that Nick actually is willing to address the role that he played in it, and Nick has written, I think, some excellent books. We've cooperated. But the first one I remember reading of yours was Strikes in the Media back in the 60s, but lots of other books.
Yes,
because
so what I recognised, you see, was that, and I mean, Grant was right to point it out, that, I mean, I recognised that, you see, my job as a radio reporter was to sort of follow the national story. And towards the end, there's no doubt about it, we the media, became the cheerleaders for what we call a return to work. And it was all a numbers game for Mrs. Thatcher. She was determined, you see, that the minute half the miners were back at work, she could declare a victory. And the whole of the newspapers, you know, were following that narrative. The men who went back to work, you'd see them idolized in the newspapers. They were called the new faces. And the radio and television, we were mostly behind the police lines, and we followed the men breaking the strike, you know, going back to work. So there was no doubt about it in my mind. We became the cheerleaders for the return to work. And my job was to report, to try to find out what was actually happening. And, you know, we did undoubtedly get swept along with the narrative that, you know, we were doing Mrs. Thatcher's business by reporting the return to work and the new faces. That's what she wanted to do, because it was wearing down the miners, wearing down support, winning public support for her position. And as Granville says, it's something that people like me have got to reflect on.
Yeah. Do you think that's changed now? Do you think the reporters now have the sort of, obviously it's on a different scale of strikes?
Well, I mean, I think there's no doubt about it that I think that's the danger. The media we can get swept along by the government's agenda. You know, governments are very clever at, and you see, when you've got a dominant conservative press which is supporting, I mean, you've only got to look at the Falklands War, for example, you know, to show how the country immediately gets behind something. And, you know, that's the position that the BBC finds itself in. And I mean, I come up and we hold events in at Wortley Hall, and sometimes some of the miners come and they said, I remember your voice. I heard you talking about the return to work. We were having breakfast, you know, we were just going out and listening to you, all that stuff about the return to work. So they remember it to this day with bitterness. And I think that probably you could say there are examples today where the media is getting swept along behind the government's agenda.
Okay, anybody else? Yes?
At the beginning, you talked about 10 national newspapers.
Yeah.
Circulation of
15 million.
We're in a very different situation.
3 million today.
Although the BBC still does daily newspapers for the headlines today, as if we were 30, 40 years
Yes.
ago.
Well,
So how do we actually rebalance the news and put the right-wing press in its little boxes?
I've just written a piece trying to explore that very point. You see, it's amazing that although the national newspapers, there's my microphone, although the national newspapers only sell 3 million copies, their reach is still very, very great. Partly because, you see, the conservative newspapers have employ the top columnists, the top commentators. They're the people you see being interviewed on radio and television. They're the people with high-profile podcasts and whatever. And it's the left, you see, which is so far outnumbered. I mean, the commentators and the columnists from the left are so far outnumbered by those from the right. So although the conservative newspapers aren't selling the copies, the reach of their columnists and commentators and people who work for them, it has got a new field out online, on radio and television. And you say, you look at the new radio and television stations which are opening up, all on the right. They're not on the left. And it's a tragedy, you know, that we haven't got some way of correcting that, of rebalancing that. And, you know, if you look at organizations on the left, think tanks, organizations like the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, we're all struggling. But you look at the right-wing think tanks and the right-wing radio and TV stations, they're the people with the money, and that's what's frightening, and that's what gives the conservative newspapers the reach that they still have.
If I could just give you one example of a think tank. The Institute of Economic Affairs published the other day a report saying that the wealth that Britain accrued in the Industrial Revolution from slavery was nothing. There was no wealth. The wealth was accrued because we were making beer, we were doing other things, but it wasn't due to slavery. That report, a ridiculously under-researched report, gets the prominence because it's picked up, as Nick said, by the commentariat, and it disseminates.
And the danger is, of course, just to make Granville's point even more seriously, that you see these things start trending on social media because this is where the right are so active. And then the BBC feels it's got to follow the story, you see, and that's when the BBC reports it. I've just written a chapter about the way the press are hounding Angela Rayner, for example. Now, there's again a case in point, you see, where the whole weight of the conservative supporting newspapers is against her, and it creates this sort of momentum, especially online. It's trending online, and the BBC feels it has to do a report, and that's the danger. We're still in the sort of position that we were in the 80s when I felt, and I look back on the day and I think, well, Nick, you were used. You know, you became part of the government's propaganda machine. I didn't want to become it, and I didn't know that I'd become it. But looking back, I have to accept that I probably was.
Okay. Yep.
There's one saving grace. On Sky, some other
Yes.
more neutral TV stations, every night they have a press preview, and the press is represented by people from the Observer and the Telegraph and the Mail. But there's always one on the left and one
on the right.
And
Yes.
generally speaking,
It's
the
pretty balanced.
The left speaker maybe slightly more intelligent than the right.
Okay, any more comments? Right.
We've exhausted everybody else.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming along tonight.
Thank you.
Just to highlight, with banners, this is part of it with banners held high, a series of fringe events that take place running up to this Saturday, when out there on morning Saturday morning, there will be the march and the speakers and so on. So there's some leaflets. If you're not aware of what's happening, there's some leaflets that you can take with you. The next event is the Red Shed. Is it, Catherine? Do you want to say?
The event on Friday in the old courtroom at 5 o'clock, and that's the defending the right to protest workshop. So please do come. We've got Gary Jackson, Christie's from the over you and
Right. So the leaflets are there. Okay. So.
And then you're speaking on Friday at the Red Shed.
Right. So yeah, I thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. So I said with Banners Held High was meant to be a one-off event in 2015, celebrating the return to work after the year-long strike. And then it's been, transformed into what's, I think, a much better event outdoor when we get nice weather, which is predicted. So you could have a good day out if you want to turn up for that. But I just want to finish with 2 points. Firstly, you've touched on the media and issues to do with media. Please have a look at the Media North store. If you want to sign up for copies of Media North, free online, please do that. But finally, I want to thank Scott for recording the session. With Banners Held High, events supporting, and
Dillis for getting us on.
Dillis, oh yeah, absolutely. Technology. Have you noticed technology isn't Nick's strong point?
Well, I do cut things out of newspapers. I'm a little bit old.
But I want to just hope you'll express your appreciation for Nick coming up all the way from Barnet
Barnet
today to give that talk. So thanks very much.